And it looks like this side of the room did not show up. And this side of the room is well represented. So congratulations. I don't know if this represents sides of the camp, but that's good. All right. Well, we are ready for our last session here on the Building Bounce workshops this year, and just thank you again all for your participation, and I hope that it's been helpful. Today we're going to do a quick overview of the idea of emotional capacity and how it relates to just emotional maturity. It's one of those strange things that people have often felt like you could be a spiritually mature person without being an emotionally mature person. Doesn't seem strange to think that you could be spiritually mature and not emotionally mature? I mean, to me, those two things ought to go together. And yet, we find that a lot of people who present as spiritually mature are actually just intelligent. Right? There's a big difference between being an intellectual Christian and being a mature Christian. There's also a difference between having been a Christian for a long time or being a Christian who serves in the church faithfully and being a mature Christian. But you stop to think about it. If you're going to define spiritual maturity from the Bible, what text might you go to look for a definition of this is what it means to be spiritually mature? I mean, there's more than one, but what comes to your mind when you think of, well, this passage is what I think of when I think of describing a spiritually mature person? 1 Corinthians 13. 1 Corinthians 13, the love chapter, love is patient, love is kind. Think about how many of those characteristics of love have to do with emotional capacity and relational skill, right? In other words, if you're a spiritually mature person, your life should be characterized by love. Well, isn't love largely about helping people, being emotionally in tune with people, having good relational skills with people? You might also think of Galatians 5, the fruit of the Spirit. What are the fruit of the Spirit? Love, joy, well, that's emotional, right? Peace, that's emotional capacity. Gentleness and self-control, all these things have to do with the way we treat people and with the way we regulate and handle our emotions. Because think about it, somebody who lacks self-control is somebody who is completely controlled by their emotions. And so they just do whatever they feel like doing at any given time. And so when you look at this, I like to use this idea that this fruit of the Spirit is a good definition of what it means to be a spiritually mature person. And thus, when you look at it, you realize that the Bible would teach us that a spiritually mature person should be an emotionally mature person. That if those two things aren't going together, that means there is something broken in the way that you have grown as a Christian. In fact, we're going to take it a step further today. And we're going to walk through, in the book, Rare Leadership, we define adult maturity, or the characteristics of adult maturity, with 4 traits that spell the word rare, hence the word rare leadership. And it is remain relational, act like yourself, return to joy, and endure hardship well. We're going to walk through those today. And as we look at this, I just want to camp out on this idea of enduring hardship well. And that is, I believe from a biblical perspective, the essence of enduring hardship well, the height, if you will, of enduring hardship well, is loving your enemies. And I believe that for a discipleship agenda at a church to really achieve its highest potential, it has to have as its goal training people on what they're going to need in order to love their enemies. You can't just tell people, start loving your enemies, like that's the most natural thing in the world. You've actually got to help them and train them to do that. So we're going to walk through some of the, what might go into that today. But let me start with a story that Jim Wilder told me about his a friend of his who was a priest in Rwanda during the time of the great massacres over there. And because a parish in the Roman Catholic Church is different than we might see in the missionary church, where you go to church based on your geography, well, because of that, they had both tribes who were, killing, the tribe that was killing the other tribe, that was practicing genocide, both tribes were members of this church. So after the genocide was over, once a truce had been called and they were trying to bring this back together, slowly members of both tribes started trickling back into the parish. Now, can you imagine the job that lay ahead of them? What are you going to do now when you've got people who have literally been killing the family members of the other people in the church? The priest himself was not immune. One of the members of the other tribe had literally killed his own mother in front of him. And that man came back to the church. What do you do? Right? Talk about putting this love your enemies thing to the test. And so what he decided was, what we would normally do is say, let's just start two churches and not make the two people interact with each other. You have this church and we'll have this church and we'll just hang out with the people that we know we get along with. They can't do that, right? In a parish setting, they didn't do that. So he started a 6-month program. And for the first 3 months, he took all of the people who had been victimized, and they went through one program. And he took all the people who had been predators, and he put them in another program. This program was mostly about forgiveness. And this program over here was mostly about repentance. And both of them were about getting your identity from Christ and more than just your tribe. And after 3 months of them training, he then mixed the groups. And they began forgiving asking for forgiveness and forgiving each other. They began practicing relational skills and restoration with each other. And when I said, do you have any pictures of this guy? He sent me one, and it's of the priest and this other African next to him smiling for the camera, and the man he's got his arm around is the man who had killed his mother. Now, you talk about loving your enemies and reconciling, that is spiritual maturity. Right? And you see the level of emotional maturity that is required in order to have that kind of spiritual maturity. So as we begin talking about this, I'll tell you that none of us start there. You have to grow into that. And but I think that we do a disservice if our discipleship agenda doesn't have that as its goal, that we learn to love like Jesus loved. So let's go back and let's review some of this. Let's go back to some of the brain science underneath this as well. So we talked about an on-off switch in your brain, between the difference between your left brain and your right brain. We said if you take your brain out of your head, it'll flop into two. There'll be the left side and the right side. And so I've given you 4 characteristics in your handouts today of the left side of the brain, and they spell the word plan, which I thought was appropriate because, the left side is all about planning how I'm going to solve problems, planning how I'm going to get things done. And so this side of my brain is the problem-solving side. It's where language, I can put things into language on this side of my brain. I can analyze situations over here on this side of the brain. And it's also where my narrative is formed, where a narrative is an explanation of life and how it all fits together, or an explanation of my experiences and how I should understand this experience has just happened. So this side of my brain is where I use language to come up with narratives to help me analyze and solve problems. Now, the challenge here, of course, is that if I try to do relationships out of the left side of my brain, there is nothing relational on this side of the brain. Nothing on this side of the brain actually attaches or bonds to anybody else. So when I'm doing relationships from this side of the brain, the best that I can ever do is damage control. Because from this side of the brain, I will see you as a problem, and because you're a problem, you're going to cause me pain and you're going to cause me to suffer. Therefore, I am going to figure out the best way to control you and to minimize the damage that you can do to me. And that's how my left brain does relationships. My left brain does relationships by doing damage control. And if I don't, and that's at its best, it does damage control. At its worst, the left side of your brain goes into what we call enemy mode. And when I go into enemy mode, I don't see you as a person to relate to. I see you as an enemy to defeat. And I will win no matter what it takes. When this is all done, I will win. I don't know if our relationship will be here, but I'm going to win. And that's when you go to an extreme. That's what happens when I do relationships totally out of the left side of my brain. Now, on the right side of your brain, we went through this yesterday. We had the 4 levels on the right side of your brain: attachment, assessment, attunement, and action. And so our goal in life is to be whole-brained people. Now, the good news is if your relational right brain is on, which is where your relational circuits are, so you'll hear me today talk about relational circuits a lot. That's basically just a synonym for your right brain. Relational circuits, that's a synonym. As long as your relational circuits are on, you automatically get your left brain too. But if your relational circuits go off, you lose your right brain and you do everything out of your left brain. And the implications of that are pretty staggering for the way that we do emotional regulation and engage relationally with other people. So this on-off switch is huge. When our switch is on, we get access to all 4 areas of the right side of our brain. The attachment center we have access to, our assessment center, our attunement center, and our action center where we remember who we are and how it's like us to act. Now, I think about the ramifications of this. If my switch is off and my relational circuits are off, it means that I do not have access to the part of my brain that remembers who I am. Think about that for a second. If I don't have access to the part of my brain that remembers who I am, who am I going to act like? Somebody else, right? I'm going to turn into somebody else, and guess who I'm going to turn into? My left brain is going to create an identity for me, whatever identity it thinks I need in order to minimize the damage that's taking place or in order to win in the confrontation that's taking place. But I will assume whatever identity I think so. So I can pretend to be nice because I think it'll get me what I want. And I can or I can become intimidating. I can turn into whoever I need to be. So when you hear people talk about wearing masks or posing and pretending they're somebody they're not, what that means is that their right brain circuits have shut down and their left brain is creating an alternative identity for them. And it will always be the identity they think will minimize damage to themselves. Does that make sense? Okay, so let's walk through this. The first one then is when my circuits are on, I will remain relational because when my circuits are on, all of my relational circuits are functioning and I have access to my attachment center. And so we talked about this earlier this week, that the way that we practice keeping our relational circuits on is with the practices we call CAKE, right? So it's curiosity, appreciation, kindness, and eye contact. These are the 4 practices that help us keep our relational circuits on. And if we notice that we have lost our curiosity, lost our appreciation, kindness, desire for eye contact, that means that our circuits are off. Now, I remember I was actually at the Leadership Center at Michigan State University last year, and I was doing a leadership training for the shareholders for a large corporation. And we put a slide up there with CAKE on it and said, this is how you know if your relational circuits are on or off. And the owner of this company just blurted out in front of all of his executives, he goes, I don't think my circuits have ever been on. At which every other person in the room looked at me and nodded, like, no, his circuits have never been on, And all of a sudden he began realizing maybe I haven't been running things with emotional maturity and as relationally as I could. And what was fascinating to me is when we started that presentation, he started the whole, it was just one of those great moments because he introduced me as the speaker for the day. But first he wanted to cast some vision for them. And the vision he cast for them is we want our company to be known as pirates. I thought, well, that's interesting. What do you mean? And he said, when our competitors see our name on the bid list, I want them to go blankety blank blank, it's them. Those cutthroats will do whatever it takes to get this bid. We're in trouble. Now here's Marcus to teach us how to be emotionally mature people, right? And what was fascinating is after their whole team went through that day's presentation, they then hired a coach who that I referred them to, who walked them through 12 months of coaching on the rare leadership. And then they invited me to come back and teach their entire national management team. But this time when he introduced me, he said, we want to be known as a company that handles our business like adults so that our clients will want to do business with us forever because they like the way we handle ourselves. Now, what a difference in intros, right? He got a completely different picture in his mind because the first vision that he set out was a left brain vision that was all about winning. The second vision he set out was a right brain vision about being relationally mature. And what they began to realize was that if you were relationally mature, people are going to want to hang out with you more, including people who want to do business with you. And so it was just a really fascinating thing to watch them. And we kind of camped out on this cake thing. You know, how do you keep your curiosity high when you're feeling upset and agitated? So, for example, one salesperson told me from a different company, he said he got a call one day from a client who was canceling one of their biggest contracts. And his first reaction was panic and then anger, right? So what's going to happen if he handles this phone call with panic and anger? Chances are they're going to lose that contract forever, right? It's like, this is just done. He said, but I had literally just that day read the chapter in Rare Leadership about cake. And I was going, curiosity, okay, I can do this. He says, I'm curious, what's going on over at your company that you guys would cancel this contract after all these years? And the guy was like, well, you wouldn't believe it. Things are just crazy here and here. And he dove in when he started practicing some validation. He said, so it sounds like you're really feeling some panic and you're really feeling some stress. And the guy goes, oh, yeah, absolutely. And what's happening now is they're creating a relational bond as he's validating the emotions, being relational, remaining relational with him. And finally, they get to the end of it, and he says, well, I hope that, when this all blows over, that we'll be able to do business together. And the guy on the other end says, you know what, I think I'm just overreacting. Let's go ahead with the contract. Now, again, I'm not saying it will always work that way, but there was no chance it was going to work that way if he hadn't remained relational. So you look at this, and you think to yourself, the opposite of remaining relational when I'm dealing with people is that I am problem first when I deal with people. As a parent, it's really easy to be problem first. You walk into the room, you go, what are you doing? Instead of walking into the room and really getting the lay of the land and kind of syncing with what's going on, connecting it at the emotional, relational level, and then dealing with the problem. So we're going to talk about this now. How do you deal with a problem in a relational way? And we call these envelope conversations. So I've explained this at a prior camp, but it's been a few years, so let me do this again. An envelope conversation is a tool that you can use when you're trying to remain relational while you have to talk about a problem. So picture that you got an envelope here, and the envelope stands for the relationship between you and the person you're talking to. What you want to do is you want to take the problem you need to talk to them about and stick it in the envelope of the relationship that you have. So what that means is you start with relationship, then you go to the problem, and then you end with relationship. So another way to look at this is you start with your right brain engaged, then you go to your left brain problem solving, and you end with your right brain engaged. Too many times when we have a problem to talk about with somebody, we'll either avoid talking about the problem because we have no idea how you do this without losing the relationship, or we lead with the problem at the cost of the relationship. And so what we're looking at here is how can I keep the relationship bigger than the problem? And the way we keep the relationship bigger than problem is we start with the relationship, then we go to problem, then we go to the relationship. Now you can mess this up pretty simply, and that is if I say to you, we start with the relational history, and then we go to the problem to be solved, and then we go to our relational future. But if I start with the relational history, like, you've always been a jerk, that's not a good start to your relational history, right? You don't go, well, you've always been this way. You've never understood me. You've never gotten along with anybody. You always have these. That's not what I mean by starting with your relational history. Relational history is like, we've been neighbors for 10 years. Or, you and I, we've grown up, you've grown up in this house. I've been your dad for a lot of years. You're establishing the relational history here. How long has it been that we've been connecting? What you don't use your relational history to attack. You use your relational history to establish the value of the relationship. Now that can be as fast as you and I just met. That's okay. That's our history. We just met. Say, but here's the problem. You just backed into my car. Now we got a problem to deal with here. Then you say, I'm hoping we can deal with this problem in a way that if we were to meet again, we'd be okay seeing each other. Here's our way we can handle this problem. When we get done, we'd still feel like being happy to be together. And so what you're doing is you're still dealing with the problems that need to be solved, but you're putting it in this envelope of relationship. You're putting it in a relational context. Now, I have a relative who's a police officer, and he's been on the force for a lot of years. And whenever there's particularly domestic dispute issues, they like to send him. And one of the reasons they like to send him is that he's really good at this. Right? He's really good at showing up in big problem situations and being relational with the people who are there and kind of putting them at ease so they realize, okay, maybe there's a relational way to get through this. He deals with the problem, and then he ends with, okay, are we all right now? Can we work on this together? Okay. And so because he's just really good at keeping relationships bigger than problems, what they found is they like to send him along with the rookies to kind of make sure that there's somebody there who's going to handle this like a grown-up. Now, they're still dealing with the problem, but you try to be relational. Now, you can't always do that. There's a time when you can't do this. And the times when you can't do this are called crises. If there's a crisis, you may draw the gun first, right? Or let's put it this way, if as a parent, if I'm walking into a room that's messy, I can take the time to put the relationship first before I deal with the problem. But if my daughter is about to step in front of a bus, I don't go, well, how do you feel about getting squished? I'm not going to take the time to, worry about her emotions at that point because we're in a crisis. It's like, stop, no, we're going to deal with the problem first. So the challenge here, of course, becomes if you're constantly leading with the problem in your conversations with people, you're functionally turning everything into a crisis. And you are going to burn people out. And they're not going to want to stay relationally engaged with you because everything's a crisis all the time. So you got to learn what is really a crisis and what can I afford to be relational about before we dive into the problem. And so this is that first step to what does emotional maturity look like? Well, first thing, we remain relational when we have to deal with problems. We do deal with the problems, but we remain relational as we deal with them. Now, I've had to even do this as I've been letting somebody go. Right? And I've had people, it's like, hey, we've been working together for a long time. We've tried this, we've tried this, we've tried this. I think it's time for you to start looking for something else. And we've done it in a way where we could still be relationally connected after they left and went and worked somewhere else. Now, you can't always do that because you can't save every relationship. Even Jesus couldn't save every relationship, right? The Pharisees never got along with him. But it wasn't because he didn't remain relational. Yeah. How does this go along with boundaries? That's a really good question. So, boundaries are basically a way of protecting everybody. So they're a way of protecting that person and you from overwhelm. And so one of the things you do with boundaries are you're saying, there are some places I won't be happy to see you. For instance, if I'm going to the bathroom, I won't be happy if you show up and start a conversation, right? Not going to be happy. If I'm in bed with my wife and you show up, not going to be happy, right? It's like there are places, times and places where I want you to know that when we meet in these times and places, you can count on me being happy to see you. So like if I'm a counselor, I might say at our appointments, at our set times for phone calls, whatever, you can count on I will be happy to be with you. But if you just stop me on the street and want to pour into your problems, it may not be a good time for me. And so for your sake, I want you to be able to count on the fact that you can be happy to be with me. So to keep our relationship bigger than what we've got to do with, we're going to set up some boundaries as our problem solving. So boundaries are a problem-solving technique, but they have to be implemented relationally. All right, so I start with a relational conversation. We talk about the problem. The boundaries may be part of the solution. And then we see, is our relationship okay now? All right, can we keep being relational? And so those go together very well as long as they fit the pattern. Okay. Any other questions I can address before we go forward?
Thinking here as we act like yourself, getting stuck with your circuits often leave you in the enemy mode. So let's say the conversation, let's say the example you gave with the one company canceling the relationship, and because of him remaining relational, he did everything obviously except the eye contact.
Right.
What if that had not gone well, and the conversation ended with both of them still in the enemy mode?
So this question is, let's go back to that illustration where we talked about the salesman who had the contract canceled, but he stayed relational. And what would that have looked like if he had not remained relational? Let's go to the next slide as we talk about this, because part of what you reference is in our next point on acting like yourself. One of the goals here is that when my relational circuits stay on, I retain access to my identity center, which means I can act like myself. If my circuits go off, I will turn into a different person. I'm not normally an angry, frantic person, but I might turn into one if my circuits go off. So what could have happened if his circuits had gone off here and he had acted with anger or he had acted with, the fear or whatever, is they probably would have just both ended up in enemy mode, both of them in their left brain, neither of them with their relational circuits on, and just like, fine, hang up. That would have been the end of the whole thing, and they probably wouldn't have had any chance of getting that resolved. The other thing that can happen with enemy mode is you go, all right, fine, we'll see, I'm calling your manager. I'm going to report you because I am going to win. That's the extreme form of staying in enemy mode. So one form is just fine, we're done, no relationship. The other one is, oh, you think this is over? Click, I'm going to get you. And so it just depends on how far into the enemy mode I've gone. So what happens here, what we're talking about acting like yourself, is when our relational circuits stay on, you can act like yourself because you have access to your identity center. But if your circuits go off, right, you lose the ability. And by the way, it only takes one of them. Curiosity, appreciation, kindness, eye contact, it only takes one of them to get your circuits back on. You don't necessarily have to have all four going to get them back on. So now there are exceptions to this, of course. There is sarcastic curiosity. And that is, when you say things like, so I'm curious, are you always this stupid? That's not really getting your circuits back on. Right? And you can do eye contact where you're trying to intimidate. And that's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about actually wanting to be relational eye contact, relational curiosity about their emotions, their perspectives, seeking understanding. So when the circuits are on, we have access to our center, and we will tend to act like ourselves, even when we're dealing with hard things. The next one, though, is when our circuits go off, right? You turn into a different person. You turn into a problem solver who values winning more than relationship. And this is a huge problem in the church. Because in the church, oftentimes, if I get into an argument and I can pull out a better biblical defense than you, and I win the argument because I use the Bible better than you, I can leave thinking I am the more spiritual person because I just beat you down, with the Bible. But that's actually spiritual abuse, because what you just did is you said, I value winning more than I value this relationship, and if I need to use the Bible to win, I will. And then the people watching a conversation like that often leave going, well, he won the argument, so he must be the more biblically astute person. That must be the more spiritually mature person. Let's make them our pastor, right? It's like, that isn't really a good idea. What we're looking for in our leaders in Christian circles is spiritual maturity that evidences itself with relational maturity and emotional maturity. Not just an ability to win when confronted by pulling out a better biblical argument than you have. And it gets really, because, who were the masters of winning using the Bible? The Pharisees, right? And that's what happened. So the Pharisees, when they went to have biblical conversations with Jesus, what was their motive? They were totally in enemy mode, and they wanted to win. And that's why it says when they just shut up and couldn't say anything anymore, it was like, because they realized that we can't win, but we have no desire for a relationship. Because they were just stuck in left brain enemy mode. So that's the third point here, is that getting stuck with your circuits off can leave you in enemy mode. And so this happens even in marriage or in parenting. So think about this in your marriage, if you're married, is like, have you ever noticed that sometimes your wife is like your friend and other times she feels like an enemy? Or sometimes, maybe as a parent, your kids feel like, oh, I love my kids, and other times it's like, oh, I just hate them. Right? And the difference here is that if I get stuck in enemy mode, I can start to see my kids as my enemies. I can start to see my husband as my enemy. I can start to see other people and if I see them as my enemy, guess what? I'm in left brain mode already, so guess what narrative I'm going to create about them? Oh, that husband of mine, he always does this, and I'm going to find a narrative that justifies me keeping them in enemy mode and justifying me doing whatever it takes to win in my, in my relationship with them. Or the same thing with one of my kids, or take it in any relationship you want. When I'm in enemy mode, the only thing I care about is winning.
You're ironic, but I found a Bible verse related to what you're talking about.
Okay.
It came to mind when you talk about, not losing a relationship with someone just to be right, or you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And it's a verse that's come to me recently on my mind. The Holy Spirit has put on my heart that I shouldn't do anything. Do nothing. This is Philippians 2:3-4. Do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit. Rather, in humility, value others above yourself, not looking to your own interests, but each of you to the interests of others.
That's excellent. He was citing Philippians 2:3-4 as a Bible passage that talks about this importance of not slipping into enemy mode, staying relational, keeping relationships bigger than problems. And the verse says, essentially, I just blanked on it again. Tell me, start it off for me. Do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit in some translations. And don't consider yourself better than other people, but instead consider their issues as more important than your own. That's a great explanation of how we keep relationships bigger than problems. And that was not happening in Philippi, which is why he follows that passage up with saying, I urge you, Euodia, and I urge these two women to get along. And what he's saying is, I want you to keep your relationships bigger than the problem here. So that's acting like ourselves. So if I don't act like myself, I'll turn into enemy mode. If you want some more biblical examples of this, read the story of David and Saul in the Old Testament and watch how quickly Saul snaps into enemy mode with David. He can go from wanting David to be his son-in-law, and thinking David is great and loving the fact that he plays and sings for him, to wanting to kill him just like that. How is it possible for somebody to be that off? Well, his switch goes off fast, and Saul has learned to live most of his life in enemy mode. And guess what? Saul has the same kind of relationship with God that he has with David. And essentially what happens when you live in enemy mode and winning is the only thing that matters to you, you don't see people as opportunities for relationship. You see as people as tools to help you win. And Saul even saw God as a tool to help him win. And it was, okay, God, are you going to help me win this or not? If not, I'll go find somebody who will, even to the point of going to a witch, right? To get the answers there. Because for Paul, the bottom line is, I've got to win. And this is a lot of shame-based cultures. You see this a lot, where winning is far more important than character because I don't want to feel shame. All right, let's continue on while we're going here. Let's go to the third. We have remain relational, act like yourself. This is return to joy. And we return to joy from 6 primary emotions that each of them needs a separate pathway back to joy. So if you look at this just from a physical standpoint, if the joy center of my brain is on the front and right of my head, behind my right eye is my joy center, When I slip into one of these, what we call sad emotions, I go to the back of my brain, and my brain has to start forming a neural pathway from this negative emotion back here, back to the front of my brain. So when you're first doing it, it can be like hacking through the jungle. It's like you don't really have a path to do this. You're trying to figure this out. And then the more times you walk down that path, the clearer it gets, the firmer it gets. Once you've experienced that emotion and returned to joy from it often enough, it now can become it's almost like having a superhighway in your brain, so that when you feel that emotion, it's like no big deal. You can get back to joy from this in 90 seconds or less. But it takes some work to get there, right? So we also find that you need a separate pathway back to joy from each of these 6 negative emotions that we call the sad emotions. So let me just walk through what these emotions are. And the sad ones start with shame. And shame basically is this sense that I am exposed. The Hebrew word for shame and the Hebrew word for nakedness are almost identical. In fact, the first time we see shame in the Bible, it's when the Adam and Eve realize they're naked. And a lot of the metaphors for shame in the Bible are about nakedness being exposed to somebody. We're going to expose your shame by exposing your nakedness. And so there is this sense of shame, like, oh, people are going to see what they shouldn't see, what I don't want them to see, and it's going to make me feel, what it's going to do is it's going to make me feel like I'm in danger of rejection. Yeah.
I've heard of that, like, I'm going to ask if this is true, what you think. Is guilt righteous through God, and shame is of the flesh or of the people?
Yeah, is guilt righteous through God and shame not? I will put it this way. There's actually 2 kinds of shame. There's healthy shame and toxic shame. And some people, to simplify it, just call one kind guilt and the other kind shame. But from your brain's experience, they're both shame. Now, a healthy shame is where I realize that something is wrong and I've done something that displeases you and something that is not bringing you joy, but I can correct that. So I take the message as, okay, this is a correctable thing and our relationship can be bigger than what's going on here. Toxic shame means I am getting a message that this issue is so big and what I've done is so reprehensible to you that our relationship is in jeopardy or over. And so toxic, so some of us, if you don't have a path back to joy from shame, you will experience all shame as if it's toxic, even if it's not meant that way. So, but you are right. I know some people, just to clarify it and keep it simple, they'll call healthy shame guilt and the other kind shame. So I'm fine with that, but from a brain perspective, they are both just forms of shame. Okay, so if this is what this feels. The other thing that we notice about shame is that when I do experience shame, I actually have a nerve that runs through the back of my neck. And when I feel shame, that nerve gets triggered, and you know what it makes me do? Hang my head. That's why when I tend to feel shame, that's why I got a picture of a guy doing this. It's like when I feel shame, my natural reaction is go, like, I've let you down, I've disappointed you, you're not happy with me. Now, in a healthy sense, you go, oh, you're right, I shouldn't have done that. Oh, that was wrong. How can we fix this? That's what it's supposed to do. But for some of us, we feel that, and it's like, it's all over. It's like, oh, no, I just got to leave. I got to go hide. I got to get out of here. I got to, get away from you. I don't know how to stay relationally engaged when I feel shame. And so it means I need a path back from shame to the joy part of my brain. That's why we call it returning to joy. I'm getting back to the joy center in my brain. And if I can't do that, then I'm just going to get stuck in shame, and I could be there for days, weeks, or years if I can never get back. So we'll talk in a minute about how do you create these pathways and how we do that. So don't worry, we'll get there. Let's go to the next one, and that is the anxiety. Anxiety is the emotion that says, I can imagine a scenario I can't handle, right? I know I can imagine an overwhelming scenario. Anxiety is always anchored in imagination. That's why you can hear something on the news and feel anxiety because what that news means to you is, that means that this bad thing's inevitable, and and that would be bigger than I could handle, or for some of us, you might hear something like that and it triggers anger. It just depends on where it's going with you. But anxiety is always related to imagination. Fear is actually reactionary. It's like, there's a snake. Oh, it almost bit me. It's like, I don't have to think about it. I just react that way. What happens with really severe anxiety is that I have imagined a catastrophe that feels inevitable. And if something in my present happens that makes me feel like a catastrophic, event is inevitable, that will trigger anxiety for me. Because it's rooted in imagination, we all feel anxious sometimes. Right? You're not a bad Christian if you feel anxious at times. The Bible doesn't say, when it says don't be anxious, it's basically saying let's return from anxiety. Let's not stay there. Here, let's get back to peace. Yes.
For one that's strong with anxiety, like constant, not just seasonal.
Yeah.
Or situation-based, but just a natural anxiety through day in, day out. And a person surrenders that anxiety day in, day out, still feels its presence.
Yes.
Would you say that's also not only a spiritual issue, but like maybe a mental imbalance?
Right. You can have if you have ongoing anxiety that never leaves, it sort of occupies your body and not just your mind. Right? So you just feel a sense of anxiety all the time. That can be chemically induced and need medical correction. It can also be something that as the capacity grows and there's more and more joy experienced, it can get better. But it does take a lot longer time because you're not just dealing with taking thoughts captive at that point. While they're both called anxiety, we're talking about imagination-based anxiety versus actually physical-based anxiety, which means your body is kicking out an anxiety message to you, whether there's anything anxious going on or not.
Does that medication then create the pathway?
No, the medication does not create the pathway. What it does, the medication just deals with the physicality of the anxiety that's being felt. There's still a need to get a switch back on, and also to begin creating a narrative of hope in your life. Because a lot of times anxiety will get married to despair, in which it feels like there is no solution, there is no end to this, and that's when it tends to just get stuck. I've been there, I've had that. I had that for almost a whole year where I couldn't get the anxiety out of my body no matter what I did. And there were a whole lot of things that went into that period of time getting better. And one of them was just changing my routine so that I was not putting as much stress on myself constantly. And some of it had to do with changing some other things. But also a big part of it for me was changing the storyline running through my head, which had been gradually getting darker and darker without me realizing it. Pardon me? Yeah.
Partially due to that because of what you do, the nature of,
Well, so some of it for me too was like I would get triggered by the news a lot, and I just had to quit watching the evening news for a long time because it was getting too triggered by things. And different people, same way. We live in a different world now with the constant social media and all the rest of it, where you can just surround yourself with 24-hour negativity if you're not careful. And it can do things to you, both to your depression, to your anger, to your anxiety. And so part of this is learning to create a rhythm to your life where there is rest and there is space and there is, It's part of the reason why we need that rhythm. So let's go to the next one, is despair. And despair is essentially hopelessness. And it is, I see no hope for the future, and I have no plan with any chance of success. So in some circles, hope is defined as having a plan. And so a lot of times if you're trying to help somebody find some hope, one of the things you want to do is help them come up with one of the tools that we're going to have in our book, Building Bounce, is a kind of anxiety planning. And it starts this way, where you write down what is the worst thing that could happen, and write it down. And then the second point too is what's the best thing that could happen? Let's write that down. And then number 3, you say, what's the most likely thing to happen? Let's write that down. And then let's make a plan to address number 3. Okay? So, yeah, what's the worst thing that can happen? What's the best thing that can happen? What's the most likely thing to happen? Now let's come up with a plan to deal with number 3. And that can help to deal with both the anxiety and the despair that are associated with not seeing how things can work out. On the other hand, there are some things, the reason that there is despair and hopelessness is like literally is no chance that this can change. And part of what I'm feeling is I will never feel joy again unless this happens, and this is impossible. Now that's always a lie. So the lie that says I could never feel joy again unless the scenario happens exactly the way I want it to, that's always a lie from the enemy. Because our joy, we can find joy along the way, even if life is hard. Our joy doesn't have to come from the fact that everything goes the way we want it to. It can come from other things along the way. So part of it is giving ourselves permission to feel that, to feel joy in the face of things that feel overwhelming in other areas of our lives. All right. Let's go to the next one. Sadness. I have lost what brought me joy. Right? Oh, I was so happy with this toy and I lost it. I'm sad, right? Or in a relationship. It's like I've lost a relationship. Now you can begin to see how a lot of these different emotions can blend together, and you can have 2 or 3 or 4 of them at the same time. And then it gets a little more complex, doesn't it? So this is why it's so important to have well-established pathways back to joy from the individual ones, because if you have them back from the individual ones, it's much easier to get a pathway back to joy from a complex emotion. So sadness, right? I've lost what brought me joy. And part of sadness is like you got to feel it. It's okay to feel these emotions. So the return to joy always starts with, it's okay for me to feel this emotion. I'm not a bad person for feeling it. I think especially in victorious Christian living world, we could be made to feel like if I was truly a victorious Christian living an abundant life, I would never feel these emotions. But that's not the point. The point is I can feel all of these emotions, but begin to learn through my walk with God, through my relationship with my friends, through the skills that I develop, that emotion doesn't have to be the end of the world, that I can bounce back from it. Anger is the next one. Anger is that feeling that says, I want to stop whatever it is that's causing me pain. I want to stop whatever is unjust. So maybe I don't just want to stop what's causing me pain. Maybe I want to stop what's causing somebody else pain because it's making me mad to see that they're causing that other person pain. This is unjust. I want to stop it. I'm angry. Now again, my beliefs can be totally wrong about something, and your emotions don't know the difference between fact and fantasy when it comes to this. In other words, if I think that you are wronging a friend of mine, I will be just as mad at you, whether that's actually happening or not. As long as I believe it's happening, I will have the anger. So part of this is that our narrative does have to change over time, or these emotions are we're not going to have a long-term solution to these answers if we don't get our narrative straight. The next one is that I feel anger when my goals are being blocked. And that is, I really, really want this to happen, and now that you've done that, this is not going to happen. So guess what? It's your fault that I'm not going to get what I wanted. Now I'm mad because you're blocking my goals. The last one here is disgust. And disgust is that sense that I look down on your incompetence. Like, really? You thought that would work? You are so dumb. Right? That's that disgust. And I remember I grew up with a whole lot of disgust because I can remember growing up looking at members of my family and in my mind going, you are such an idiot. Right? Which is a form of disgust because I'm thinking, you really thought that was going to work? It's like, don't you know mom and dad by now to know that isn't going to work? That's disgust. And one of the things that can happen is that the more competent you become, the easier it is to feel disgust. And so it's very important for us as mature people know how to get back to joy from disgust and not just get stuck there and deal with everybody out of that emotion. Because that emotion does tend to promote pride. because I'm looking down at people. So these are the sad emotions, right? These are the big 6 emotions. You can kind of think of them as a color wheel of emotion from which all the other negative emotions get formed. And we need to learn how to get back to joy from them. So let me give you a simple tool on how we get back to joy from them, and it's called VCR. And I've explained this other times I've been at camp, so if you've been here in the past, you've probably heard this. VCR stands for Validate, Comfort, Recover, or in our book, Rare Leadership, we call it Validate, Comfort, Repattern. And the reason we call it repattern in the book is your brain is learning a new pattern of how to do this. But it works like this. Validate is your right brain beginning to intersect with your left brain. So I'm having a right brain, I am synchronizing with the emotion. Now I can do validate, comfort, recover with somebody else and their emotions, or I can do it with myself and my emotions. So if I'm listening to you and I'm hearing you talk about a situation, what should be happening first is I should be listening for the emotion that you are feeling, and I should try to validate that emotion. That should be the first agenda in the conversation. Say, so you're feeling hope about this, it sounds like, or you're feeling hopeless about this, aren't you? And I don't have to agree that you should be feeling that. I'm just identifying where are you. And I can do the same thing with myself. It's like, oh, wow, you know what? I'm actually feeling anxiety. But if I think it's wrong for a Christian to feel anxiety, I may not admit it. So I have to be honest with myself. It's like, this is where I'm at. This is what I'm feeling. Let's put a name to this. And so synchronizing with the emotion, putting a name to it, is beginning to connect the right and left hemispheres of my brain together. And that's validation. So we validate by naming an emotion accurately. So if somebody's talking to me and they're feeling hopeless and I'm saying, why are you so angry? I'm not validating, am I? Because I have to be accurate about the emotion they're feeling, not just, putting it on them. So name it accurately, and then to take it to the next level, express to them that you have some understanding of why they're feeling that way. So you're feeling this way because you feel like this person betrayed you, or you feel like this person did something wrong to you, or they're blocking your goals and it's making you angry. Is that what I'm hearing? That's validation. The next step is comfort. What we do with comfort now is our left brain analytical mind is going to work here going, how can I take this problem that I'm hearing and make it smaller? Right? We said earlier in the week, if you want to have a lot of friends, be the sort of person who makes problems smaller. Be the sort of person who validates well, and the sort of person who makes problems smaller, and you will not have a problem making friends. So the validation starts with, where are you at emotionally, making the problem smaller. The two main ways that we make problems smaller is by offering a new perspective or a new practice that they can do to solve the problem. So you might say, well, have you looked at it like this? Or have you tried doing that, right? And if it works, you've made the problem small. Or if you say, let me do that for you, I can make the problem smaller, maybe by offering to help in some way. And you know that we get to recovery, you know that they've recovered when their relational circuits come back on. Like, okay, I feel like myself again, thank you. And when I feel like myself again, I can kind of go on dealing with life. But, and that's what I'm looking for. So the validate, comfort, recover process, basically saying is my circuits are off, I'm stuck in one or more of these emotions. I need somebody to recognize and see where I'm at and enter into that place with me. And then do something to help make this smaller so that I feel like, okay, I can breathe again, I feel like myself again, we can go forward. That's recover. Yeah, and if you can never find anybody who can truly empathize, it's really hard because you've got to learn to do it for yourself, even if they don't. And ultimately, we want to build a connection with God where we know that He empathizes and gets it too. So those are the two things. All right, so we validate, we comfort, then the last thing is that it leads to recovery. Now, the reason we call that repatterning in Rare Leadership is that if you've never done this before, if you haven't grown up doing this, your brain is literally learning a new pattern of how to deal with these emotions. Now, I know of a counseling center that did a lot of telephone counseling, and when they would meet with people on the phone, they always had two people each on the phone. So if you were to call them, you get 2 people on the other end of the line for your appointment. And one of them, their only job was to validate all the emotions they heard from you. And the other person, their job was to try to bring some comforting perspective or solution. And they would just go back and forth. And one of the things that you find is, like, for example, if somebody's been diagnosed borderline personality or something like that, that essentially means that they have no capacity to return to joy from any emotion. They don't know how to do it. So they just end up in their left brain all the time. And so even with some of the most extreme cases of these, what they found was that after a month or 2 of constantly talking to people who would validate their emotion and help them make it smaller, their brains learned how to do it, and people began picking up skills they hadn't had before. And it only took about a month, right? Maybe 2 per emotion as they were dealing with them.
What about the case, and sometimes the case for multiple mental health disorders?
Yeah.
Like paranoid schizophrenia or borderline personality disorder.
Right.
Being induced by physical traumas like car accident.
Right.
Or abuse in their childhood.
Right, you're right. There isn't, I don't want to universalize this and say all borderline can be solved this way. I'm just saying that there have been borderlines who have been helped by this. But some of these disorders are created by physical problems. And that is, for example, like you mentioned, sometimes somebody can be in a car accident and it will, because schizophrenia, for example, means that your physical brain isn't functioning properly. So you can't just, train your way out of that. The same way, if there's something physically wrong with the brain that's causing this, then you need a physical solution for it. But what we're talking about are the things that we do have under our control that we can begin building. So the beauty of this is there's something in your brain called brain plasticity, which means that for as long as you live, you can continue to grow the connections in your brain. And have you ever seen like a movie of somebody who got a head trauma? Maybe they got shot or they got hit in the head and their whole personality changed? All right? One of the reasons that happens is that the damage is done right to this center behind their right eye that remembers who they are. So if I lose that, I'll get amnesia. If I get damage to that, I won't remember who I am. But you notice in most of those movies, they start over and they create a new personality, right? Because they have to start forming a new identity from that point. And the good news is that they can, because there's this thing called brain plasticity that says it can continue to grow and develop for as long as I live. Now it's I suppose we get to a certain point where things are starting to break down physically in the brain, then my capacity to do that also diminishes. Okay. All right, last thing, we'll wrap up with this, and that is we endure hardship well. And I started with this, I just want to end with this. And that is that if we're going to be truly spiritually mature people, then the things that we do in discipleship should be leading us to be more loving people. And the only way that's going to happen is if we are in relational contexts and working on things relationally. You can't become a super mature person just by isolating yourself and studying the Bible. You can become a really intellectual Christian that way, but we don't develop our spirituality completely in isolation. We at some point have to rub shoulders with other Christians and learn how to love them. And the only way we want to learn how to love them is we got to learn, how do I stay my relational self even when they do things that trigger me? How do I stay acting like myself? How do I grow my capacity to stay my relational self? And I think that's deeply connected to this idea of love, because love is not simply a choice, because choice is on the left side of my brain. Love is an attachment that I form with someone else. And when I have a love attachment with somebody, it will affect my choices, right? Because I love my wife and have an attachment to her, when I have to make a choice about how to handle things, my brain, if it remembers who I am, will say, hey, you're the person who loves her. Let's act like that. And I'm not having to constantly, just go back to ground zero going, okay, let's choose to love her today. Okay, let's choose to love her today, right? I'm not doing that. I already have an attachment. So the attachments, if you can think of it this way, if my brain is a tree, My attachments are the roots of that tree that anchor it to the ground, and my choices are the leaves. Right? My choices can be very fickle. Sometimes I make really good choices about my wife. Sometimes I make really stupid choices about her, but the anchor is there, right? The roots are solid. The attachment is solid. And so the more that we learn to live out of the attachment, the better choices we'll make because we continue acting like ourselves. Make sense? So that's all part of that. If you want more on that, again, the book Rare Leadership has most of this in it. Well, I don't think we actually have books available today. So if you want any more books today, you'll have to go to our website, deeperwalkinternational.org. It's at the bottom of the page, I believe. So I'm actually leaving now to go home. So I have to take my son home tonight. But yes. Did I talk about it growing our attachment style? Is that what you said? I'm not sure I heard you. Growing our attachment to God was Wednesday's talk. And the book that we recommended there was Joyful Journey. Okay. All right. Well, thank you guys for your for time and taking your time to be here. And it's been enjoyable. Thank you.